Welcome to this episode of Fridays with Fintelekt. My guest today is Sofia El Mansouri, or the Compliance Lady as she is popularly known. Sofia is based in Morocco and is a compliance consultant, speaker, and writer, and an ethics and integrity advocate who speaks about topics related to the rule of law, compliance, corruption, financial crime, and money laundering. She has been in the legal and compliance space for over 14 years, and before transforming into the compliance lady, has worked as a legal and compliance director based in the UAE, developing, implementing, and monitoring international compliance programs. Sophia, welcome to Fridays with Fintelekt. And at the outset, can you give our audience a quick overview about yourself and your work?
It's an absolute pleasure being here today. Thank you for having me in your podcast. As you rightly mentioned, I have been in the legal and compliance space for over a decade. I've been based mostly in the UAE, working in-house for multinationals and for governmental entities in the UAE. And in the last few years, I've relocated back home to Morocco, where I operate currently. And I am a consultant, so I work, on consultancy basis now. And I specialize in anti-corruption. I specialize also in anti-money laundering. But certainly what we do today is very different than what we used to do in-house. So it's a lot more enriching, and it touches on a lot more aspects of financial crime.
Sophia, corruption and money laundering are integrally connected issues. They both impact the financial integrity and stability of countries. In this century, and especially since the financial crisis of 2008, there has been considerable focus on the fight against corruption and money laundering, especially by international bodies such as the G20, FATF, World Bank, and the IMF. What are your views on the progress that has been achieved so far?
Thank you for asking, Shirish. That's an excellent question. So indeed, there has been considerable focus these last few years on the fight against corruption. And as you mentioned, the financial crisis of 2008 as a starting point, so it'd be obviously quite difficult to enumerate all the developments that have happened in over a decade in this short conversation, but we can certainly refer to a few which are noteworthy, of successes and also not so successful initiatives. So we will start with the G20. So the G20, for example, has shown great initiative in the last decade. It has notably set up a specific working group on anti-corruption, which held several sessions dedicated to anti-corruption. It has also actively engaged in constructive dialogue with international organizations like the UNODC, the OECD, as you mentioned, the IMF, FATF, but also the World Bank. And these dialogues were done always in the spirit of joint collaboration between these international organizations. Now, out of this working group, more than 60 documents were developed and published to address the variety of corruption topics, such as shell companies' ownership, conflicts of interest, public procurement, asset disclosure, to name a few. But truth be told, as much as there have been successes, there's still a lot to be done. For one cannot mention the fight against corruption without referring to the fight against money laundering, because the two go hand in hand. So FATF has issued a fair amount of guidance on this subject and explain in great detail the link between corruption and money laundering. In recent years, particularly, it has placed focus on the improvement of beneficial ownership transparency. And as a result, we are starting to see more and more countries adopting beneficial owner registries. The problem, however, is always a problem, is that the actual implementation of FATF measures by G20 countries remains unfortunately inconsistent. So today, for example, there are still gaps in the availability of beneficial owner information. So FATF has recently reminded the G20 countries that up-to-date and accurate information needed to be rapidly available to authorities so that they could stop anonymous shell companies laundering funds issued from corrupt proceeds. FATF has also asked the G20 countries to show leadership on this front, so other parts of the world may also follow. This is one point. Another aspect of where we're starting to see, where we still have gaps in the anti-corruption fight is on the role of the non-financial sectors. So non-financial sectors also continue to play a role in transnational corruption. And we have seen throughout recent scandals like the Panama Papers or the Luanda leaks, for example, the light, they have shed a light on the role of professional enablers in whitewashing financial crime. So the OECD in particular has expanded at length on this topic recently. Unfortunately, as long as lawyers, accountants, and company service providers remain outside of the regulatory tent, law enforcement agencies will have difficulty building strong corruption and money laundering cases against perpetrators. On a more positive note, however, 2010 saw the birth of the UK Bribery Act, and 2016 saw the birth of the French Sapin 2 law. So together with the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, these anti-corruption regimes have imposed much more stringent sanctions and regulations on companies, obviously, that are operating multinationally, and restricted, obviously, their activities for those who are engaging in foreign bribery. So another notable aspect of these anti-corruption regimes is the introduction of anti-corruption compliance programs. So now with these anti-corruption compliance programs, corporations are less inclined to engage in bribery domestically and abroad. So the enforcement actions, that we see obviously emanating out of the US, the UK, or France always make for fascinating reads to understand the various corruption schemes employed by companies, obviously who are interested to win contracts in various jurisdictions and expand their market share there. But even in emerging markets, we saw the birth of formidable anti-corruption initiatives, notably in Brazil, after the Lava Jato scandal, and in Malaysia, after the 1MDB scandal. So those are two emerging countries that have shown great initiative on the anti-corruption front. Unfortunately, they came out, these initiatives came out after scandals, but hey, as long as something positive came out of it in the end, that's also noteworthy. Now, the World Bank and IMF are also playing a non-negligible role in imposing ethics and integrity measures. And usually they impose such measures before extending financial assistance to countries. So, obviously countries now are more on the spot to implement some of these measures before getting access to this financial assistance. On a more local level, we have seen open government reforms, national anti-corruption strategies, and these strategies have obviously been very effective in promoting an ethos of transparency and making conditions less conducive to corrupt activity. However, the big however is their impact will depend on several factors. First of all, political will, collaboration between the public and the private sector, fiscal transparency, technology, whistleblower protection, a free and independent media, a robust civil society, and effective accountability and sanctioning mechanisms.
Sophia, there are already reports that the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted into a huge setback for all the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and eradication of corruption is one of them. How is the pandemic impacting anti-corruption measures, according to you?
Unfortunately, as the world continues to battle COVID-19, criminals and corrupt officials are continuing to misappropriate funds and misusing government contracts for personal gain. Some countries have even reported theft of COVID-19 funds, response funds. So this is particularly damaging for our communities where money is flowing out of our countries and our economies at precisely a time where our healthcare system needs it most. So that's extremely unfortunate. As the UN Secretary General recently stated, corruption is criminal, immoral, and the ultimate betrayal of public trust. It's even more damaging in times of crisis, as the world is experiencing now with the COVID-19 pandemic. So just for the sake of illustration, Shirish, during this crisis, there has been considerable demand for medical equipment, such as respirators, oxygen, disposable gloves, masks, disinfectants, COVID-19 tests, this sort of equipment. So health ministries and other health actors have had to procure large quantities of these products under considerable time pressure. In such a context, there is a considerable risk of questionable commissions, kickbacks, overinflated prices, facilitation payments. Another example, unfortunately, would be preferential access to medical services, when you have an overburdened medical health system. So unfortunately, theft, overpricing, corruption are just a few of the scandals that were noted, during the COVID-19 crisis. So the hard truth is, in these times of humanitarian and socio-economic crisis, policymakers are more likely to be consumed with depressing short-term relief efforts than with corruption. So this can result in an increased risk of mismanagement, misappropriation of available funds and resources, and not prioritizing controls and sanctioning corrupt behavior. So unfortunately, there's a lot of work to be done still, as long as we're battling this pandemic.
The Transparency International Corruption Index finds that no country is free from the evils of corruption. Shell companies have been a particularly common vehicle used by criminals for bribery and for concealing the origins of ill-gotten wealth, as is obvious from several exposés which involve high-profile individuals across the world. Where are the gaps in tackling corruption-related issues? Is it the lack of political will or the lack of global cooperation that is responsible?
That's also an excellent question, Shirish. When we talk about shell companies, first of all, we must inevitably refer to the role that secrecy jurisdictions play, from a corruption and money laundering perspective. So as you are well aware, funds that are used to pay bribes or that are embezzled by public officials rely on the secrecy of these jurisdictions, which afford secrecy in company ownership, secrecy in assets. So obviously they take advantage of that. Another factor to consider is the legitimacy afforded to legal corporations that are registered in well-respected places. So you take jurisdictions like the US or the UK, for example, and you establish a company there, people are less likely to question the legitimacy of these companies and their, obviously their repute. That makes it much easier for anonymous shell companies to open bank accounts and wire ill-gotten money anywhere in the world. Now, unfortunately, the solution to this problem has been addressed, and it is the establishment of solid beneficial ownership registries. Now, while the UK, for example, has implemented a registry, it's still subject to vulnerabilities today. And, these gaps enable corrupt individuals to exploit the system. The US has adopted the Corporate Transparency Act earlier this year and is in the process of implementing a registry of its own. But it could certainly benefit from learning where other countries have gone wrong in order to make their registry accurate. So, in the end, beneficial ownership registries are as good as the information they contain. So as long as companies are allowed to appoint nominee shareholders, front people as legal owners, set up several layers of ownership in different secrecy jurisdictions, and are unfortunately assisted by professional enablers that help them set up these these complex legal and financial structures. They will continue to conceal ownership, make it harder for law enforcement, to find out who the real owners are. Not just law enforcement, but also they're making our life difficult as compliance officers, So we're going to continue having a hard time tracing who the ultimate beneficial owners are of these entities. So given the existing gaps and weaknesses in various countries' AML systems, and beneficial owner registries, which are obviously still gappy, we shall say, it's still likely that corrupt individuals will continue to rely on these existing mechanisms and make bribe payments, as well as use these shell companies to hide and launder their proceeds.
So President Biden's new national security study memo is being hailed as a game changer in the fight against corruption. Can you take our listeners through some of the key initiatives and their implications for AML?
Yes, so that's indeed a game changer. So the Biden memo, as I like to call it, is certainly poised to send a strong message to the international community about President Biden's commitment to combating corruption. So for one, President Biden upgraded the fight against corruption to a national security interest. Essentially, the US is seeing corruption as a fundamental threat to democracy. Okay, that's the reason behind this memo. The memo covers some of the themes that we've discussed in earlier questions, such as anonymous shell companies, opaque financial systems. When we say obviously opaque financial systems, we refer to these secrecy jurisdictions, and professional service providers that enable the movement and laundering of illicit wealth, including in the United States. So obviously, we won't cover the entire memo in this conversation, but for the benefit of our AML listeners, the memo directs the US government to robustly implement federal law, that requires companies to disclose their beneficial ownership. So we've mentioned it earlier, the US is setting up this corporate registry, this beneficial owner corporate registry. So the memo is calling, obviously, for everyone to abide by this new Corporate Transparency Act, which was signed into law earlier this year. And so companies will therefore need to prepare for the ownership reporting requirements. That's very important. So I mean, the final detail of what they will need to report are still not published yet, but that's something that will be coming up in the next few months. But that's certainly something that compliance officers may prepare for, already. The memo also called for an interagency reports and recommendations. So US agencies are basically called to put, recommendations in place, which will serve as a basis for the new US anti-corruption strategy, both at home and abroad. Okay. So obviously the memo, the report itself is required to develop a strategy to combat all forms of illicit finance in the United States and in international financial systems. And obviously, by requiring companies to report their beneficial owner or owners to the Department of Treasury. So what this suggests is that the Biden administration may develop more legislative or regulatory requirements to combat illicit finance beyond this beneficial ownership requirements. So among the new reforms which are being discussed currently in the US, which are not yet implemented into law, but they're in discussion. You have a rule requiring investment advisors to comply with AML rules, and obviously enhanced financial reporting requirements for domestic and foreign financial institutions. So these reporting requirements are also in discussion. This is something to look out for. This also includes a specific cryptocurrency reporting requirement. So what this suggests to us is that financial institutions and their regulators will probably be once again in the front lines of these new efforts. As a summary, we could say that financial institutions should take proactive steps to prepare for this increased AML enforcement and more stringent regulatory requirements. So if they have a compliance program in place, it'd be good to review and strengthen their existing programs. If they don't, they should certainly start looking at implementing one. Now, this is for financial institutions, but for investment advisors and professional service providers such as lawyers, accountants, there is a suggestion out of this memo that there'll be more scrutiny on the illicit finance aspect. So there is certainly a prospect that new regulations could subject them as well to AML rules. So this is something to also keep in mind and who knows, maybe prepare for.
Sophia, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts with the Fintelekt community. It was indeed a pleasure speaking with you.
The pleasure was all mine.